Cool. So, welcome everyone to September's meeting of the Borough Plan Advisory Committee. So, we haven't got any members of the public here today, but we will be filmed. So, say hello to everyone else who's online watching us. There is no fire alarm scheduled tonight, so if one does go off, do depart via the building at the rear. And so tonight we will hear an updated statement of community involvement. So we reviewed this draft earlier, middle last year, and there's been a further revision. And we've got 2 reports for inclusion as part of the evidence base of the Borough Plan. So it's a strategic housing needs report and a playing pitch strategy. And we've also got a draft South West London waste consultation report. And I think we may not have the risk register here today, but we'll definitely see it for the next meeting because it's only been a month since the last time we saw it. So there's, other than, as we know, the sheep setting, which is the Mayor's London plans, hasn't been signed off yet, so we are officially working for that, although we do know a lot of the headline figures. And so it's come up to 7:20. So our plan for the meeting to go on for no longer than 9 o'clock, depending on level of questioning. So Linda is giving apologies for absence, but I've got no other apologies.
Shouldn't you?
For lateness, apologies
Yeah,
for lateness. And have you got any declarations of interest?
I've moved on from my previous role.
Have you moved on? Ah, congratulations. Cool. So notes from the previous meeting, sorry?
Yes, they're on page 1, if anyone has any ones.
So I've just got a few things to point out. So we've got so obviously we heard last time the Wimbledon Master Plan Consultation report, and I believe we're probably going to see that again before it goes out to another round of consultation towards the end of the year. Is that right?
You will see it after it comes back, because what the version you see is pretty close to where we're going for consultation.
Okay.
So there will be a consultation that takes place between now and Christmas. We've got the Borough Plan meeting scheduled for late November, which might coincide with towards the end of the consultation.
Cool.
I think that's what we recommend as officers.
Fine. Item 5, which was the HMO report, has been moved to the next meeting because of the way meetings lie and the need for cabinet sign-off is not yet prepared. And we're due to receive a presentation on the Morgan Master Plan in November. I know previously raised the possibility of a special meeting in October, but earlier on today it was confirmed we'll move that to the standard November meeting, and so we don't need to change agendas and anything at all. Is there any questions or points of clarification? Cool. Right, so over to our first item, statement of community involvement. So I am going to sort of allocate 20-30 minutes depending on questions, comments, feedback. I'll just set the tone before. Tara, do you want to talk further on this? Yeah, I'll set the tone that basically, obviously outlines both what the council and developers, how they engage with local communities, and for the background, as we know, last one was adopted in 2006, and a lot has moved on since then. Advent of social media, a lot more change how people assimilate information, but also the pace of development as well has changed. So it is a legal requirement and will form part of the plan moving forward.
Thank you, Chair. Just really briefly, because you've seen the report before and the actual words here are quite self-explanatory. I'd just like to apologise and point out a couple of things that might need to be corrected. One is in the recommendation of the report, it says that it will go to Cabinet and Council for 6 weeks consultation. That's not correct. It won't go to full Council, it will just go to Cabinet under the standard draft procedure. So delete the word Council. Secondly, that the there is something in the body of the statement of community involvement relating to planning applications and consultation on that. That was written prior to the recent changes proposed by the development control team regarding uploading comments online. So we will update the SCI with whatever approach the council agrees and consult on it before it goes out.
Mm-hmm.
And thirdly, it's thanks to the chair, actually, there's a good point made about asking for websites to be fully disability access. So the council's website is, so people with disabilities such as the devices that read websites can access the council's website. But as you know, we encourage developers to put up websites relating to their sites, especially before the applications come in. And it's really making sure that their websites are also able to be accessed by people with disabilities. So we'd like to add a small sentence to the SCI.
Brilliant. Thanks, Sarah. I think that, that additional sentence, I think maybe on page 12.
Mm-hmm.
And for a bit of background, happy to talk about it at length because touch on it on my day job. But effectively, changes in government legislation means any website, any new website, which is paid for by public funds, needs to meet AA accessibility rating, which means that are outlined certain things that screen readers can read it effectively and work. Of course, developers are not necessarily public organisations, but at the same time, as a body commissioning a plan and commissioning a vision for a borough, it's on us to set standards so that we can ensure as many people locally as possible can access the information. And it's, frankly, it's what web developers should be doing anyway if you're good. Brilliant. I think there was one point in addition I wanted to raise about just maybe site-touring or looped into the final version of the plan, because while recommendation B, we delegate the Director of Environment and Regeneration Consultation cabinet member to sign it off. I think it's worth just, I'm happy to do that, to be cited and just loop everyone in, so that everyone knows what was agreed here, but also the end product, how it evolves, given the considerations that Tara has outlined. I, for one, am pretty keen about how we do engagement with residents on issues like this. So happy to do that.
Well, sure, that's in the notes of the meeting, we'll do that.
Brilliant. Right. Are there any questions, comments? Do you want to go through the report?
Can I just quickly ask a question before we get into the nitty-gritty of the report? You mentioned the discussion that's happened around sharing people's comments on the council website. Is that something that we can add a comment in here now, make a recommendation on via our discussions around this? Is it worth us discussing as part of this, or is that just something that's going to happen elsewhere and we'll sort of pass it through and then?
That's a good question. I think we're definitely discussing. As far as I'm aware of the background to it, it's sort of technological issue. So it's how you make those. How do you, corporately, how do you de-risk yourself from sharing information? Because people write a lot of information in terms of, I don't agree with this building because I personally suffer from X, Y, and Z, and all the various issues like that. I'm aware that other councils use other type of systems, so I think we may be looking into that. So what we could do is separate the issue of the wording of the SCI versus questions and comments about what is happening in this space, and try and get an answer and bring it back to either next committee or do it via email.
Okay.
Does that sound good? So do you have a particular follow-up other than what's happening?
No. I think you've seen the discussion and the fact that actually it's good for people to be able to where there is obviously permission from the residents.
Aren't planning applications already implementing that? Because there's been queries where they've not recorded the results of the consultation and I thought
Exactly that. Yeah. So that's
still. So are they still putting it online now or not?
So that's I believe it's
Yeah.
subject to the consultation.
Right.
So because this document is pre that, it's the lay of the land as it is now. But when the consultation reports and if it's decided to go ahead, then the point Carl was making was this document will need to be amended to reflect that fact. But at the same time, there's an underlying what is actually the issue here. You know, it's not necessarily GDPR, it's actually the technology behind that.
Yeah.
And understand what's the pipeline, because it doesn't necessarily mean it won't happen in the future. It just means currently our systems may or may not be able to do that. And because we're not officers, we don't know the ins and outs of how it works. And sometimes, frankly, you don't want to know how some tech works because.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose in a sort of, it doesn't matter.
No, go.
In a sort of practical sense, if you're scanning a piece of paper and putting it up, then you could create a form whereby you can quite easily block out people's details. But
That's
sort
true.
of, yeah, but like you say, it's going through the process.
I think the software they're looking at the moment is only 80% accurate in blocking out the private details. So that 20% error is where potentially you could have problems in terms of GDPR. So looking at other alternatives, is there any software which is 95% or 99% accurate in terms of deleting the private details? That's the issue at the moment.
Yeah. So I think we've addressed.
Yeah, but we can get some, again, if we can get a line or two just to understand the background, happy to share that because I'm genuinely interested about how it works from a data perspective. But yeah, thanks.
Yeah, no, thanks for that.
I don't know. So we're just talking about the state and community involvement, and we're just running through it from the beginning. We've outlined that there
Page
are...
30.
Yeah. So, and just outline that there's going to be two suggestions from myself, if everyone agrees. One is on page 12 to include a line about websites. We suggest developers have a website and it should meet AA accessibility is the minimum government standard, and also that the final version of this document I as chair have sight of, so that I can share the final version because due to other things going on, particularly the change in how planning is reported in terms of the comments, we want to know what the final version of this thing is before it goes through, because we may have more feedback ourselves. Is there any...
You're talking about redacting?
Yeah, exactly that. And then we went on to talk about software. Is there any further questions, comments? We can go through it page by page if we want to.
I will feel there's a lot of work goes into this, but I don't know what other members find, but I always find that when the feedback is coming back, there are certain people in my area that contact me, but they never, and I always say things like, don't tell me, send it in, and they never do. It's nearly always the usual suspects, and I find that incredibly frustrating. Because sometimes the people who, if you like, whisper in my ear have much more, how can I put it, much more broad-minded views on what we should be doing, whereas the usual suspects are normally narrowing down and focusing on particular items that are, if you like, they're bugbears. Is that a good way of putting it? It's just a comment.
Okay. Are there any other questions? If there's not, do we want to agree on the recommendations as outlined by Tara? Do you want to just quickly recap what these are?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, just to say that there's one correction to the recommendation A, is that please delete the words "and council," because the democratic procedure in Merton is that Cabinet approves documents such as this for consultation. It doesn't go to full council for the consultation. It might go to full council for the final approval, but not for the consultation.
I mean, it does say the consultation is October to December. There's a 6-month period in there somewhere. But when are we likely to see?
It will. What we probably will do is attach it to other consultations that are going on at that time. So 2 big things will be happening in plan making. One is when the master plan will be consulted then, and the other is the South London Waste Plan. And so I was speaking to the chair earlier actually and saying, essentially this document is asking people how they want to be asked questions.
Yeah.
And if you ask people how they want to be asked without any other background, they're just bored or fed up or they think it's a waste of time. It's much better to be asking them something meaningful and then say, by the way, what did you think of this consultation? What could we improve? Are there any other things you think we should have done? Not just go out cold and say, how would you like us to consult you now that we're consulting you? So what we'll do is both of those consultations take place between October and December. The waste plan's probably the end of October to mid-December. I'm not quite sure of when the master plan dates, but it's round about the same time. So we'll make sure that it's 6 weeks covering those. And if it's a bit longer than 6 weeks, but as they overlap, that's fine. As long as we get to a wide range of people.
Brilliant. Okay, so that was recommendation A, and then there was B, and then B part A, isn't it? So we've got A is remove the council from there, and then B is obviously delegate to Chris to the Director of Environment and Regeneration, cabinet member, and part of that is that myself as chair will be looped into the
we'll send it on, yes, we can into that or into the consultation section of the report. That will make sure you're right.
All right, so is that agreed? Second? Excellent. Right, so on to the second item, which is the Strategic Housing Needs Assessment Report. So I appreciate it was a weighty document, and it is actually a really fascinating, interesting read. I'll set the scene before, no doubt Tara has some additional comments to draw our attention to. But clearly the document itself makes recommendations about the housing and rental market in the borough. And the whole details of the document is the minimum viable number of homes we can realistically build per year, given the fact of our geography, but also our history of doing so. As we know, the Mayor's London plan is a draft number of about 1,400, and what's suggested here is a minimum of around 800 to about 1,300 as a contingency. And just to flag, it's not just about housing numbers, it's actually about the need for 3 beds and above, because the change in demographics, as we know, we're getting a lot of families, a lot of older people as well moving in the borough. So it is the, to look at the demographics there, it is the change in profile. And if we just summarise what the report says in terms of the housing stock. So we've got a higher number of mortgage holders than London average, a higher number of private renters than London average, but a lower number of social renters. So this is the lay of the land that we have at the minute. And the document goes into very detail the differences between the GLA population projections versus what the nationally used measure, the SPP, so sub-national population projections. It's a bit geeky stuff, but basically it shows that the GLA's estimates are double that than what another figure would show. And also, the report also goes into a bit of detail about the market instability due to Brexit. And a passion of mine actually references the need for additional domestic violence housing. So I think that's really a key thing as well. It's good. I was really pleased when I saw it in the report. So Tara, is there any additional stuff that we should have our attention focused on?
Chair, I might pass over to my colleague Valerie in a moment if that's okay.
Sure.
But main thing to say, one of the things to say is this is a very big document. It contains a lot of information, and please take your time with it. So I don't feel that you just have this opportunity to ask questions, because it is an assessment and it's not going on for approval or for anything else. What it is evidence that we will use for the local plan, that will be used for planning applications, that will probably be used by our housing colleagues for various strategies and approaches as well. So it really will underpin lots of things in the council over time. And it's also pretty new. We got it towards the end of July, so we've had about 5 weeks, well, 4 weeks ourselves before we wrote these reports to absorb it. So take your time, don't be overwhelmed by the wealth of information. It is a really useful starting point for setting our affordable housing policies and moving forward with the housing needs in this borough. Like many boroughs in London and the South East, there is a pretty overwhelming need for new homes. And this is something we're trying to achieve in the context of creating really good communities. So that's not just building houses and not having regard to design or infrastructure or anything like that. The report has a lot of data on population projections and on aspects of housing, so that sort of summary at the front is quite good for that. But I don't think there's any particular key points in there that would surprise us. Actually, the one point that Valerie mentioned earlier that I'm now going to try and take credit for is that there is a need for all sizes of homes in Merton. There's often a perception, especially in the Mayor's London plan at the moment, that London just needs one and 2 beds properties, and that's not the case. In a borough like Merton, we also need 3+ beds, and it's a fairly even spread across that. That's slightly in contradiction to the plan for the whole of London, but Merton isn't too exceptional in terms of outer London. And a lot of the statistics, as the Chair said, are very close to London average for the amount of private rented for various other things in Merton. So feel free, please. Valerie, is there anything else you want to add?
No, I can't really think. The only other thing to add is with regards to future housing mix, what the study work is showing is that at least half, 50% of that should be affordable housing with 80-20 split. So the majority of that affordable housing element being low cost affordable housing, so that being social rented and affordable rent. One of the things that we need to think about as a borough is in terms of the affordable rent definition, the Mayor's national guidance states it as being up to 80% of market rented homes, whereas the London plan says that the London affordable rent level, because of the substantial cost of housing or values of housing in London, should be substantially less than 80%. So, as Tara said, we've received this report fairly recently. There's a lot that we're going to need to digest as officers and use to inform on the draft, use to inform on the local plan policies. But as Tara's quite rightly said, that needs to be set within the context of sort of wider sort of strategic planning aims, e.g. viability. So.
If anyone's got any questions.
Yeah.
How often do we do strategic assessment like this?
I've forgotten when the last one is.
Last one was about 5 or 6 years ago.
Was this prompted really by the high target we were given?
For a new local plan, we have to do one anyway. So even if the target would be exactly the same, we'd have to do this. SHMA was over 6 years, and for housing stuff in particular, we all know how quickly the market moves. Mm-hmm. If your information is more than about 3 years old, you should really be looking to either revise it or completely review. I can't recall the last SHMA we had here at Merton, but it's definitely more than 5 years.
But rents, property prices have changed so dramatically in some areas as well. So if we're talking about affordable, it's just mental, really. Yeah. In my area, where we've got a Southwest 17 postcode in part of the wall, the properties went from 300,000 to 700. A couple of years ago. It was absolutely bonkers. So that massive leap then into property value is going to really have an impact. And affordable is, nobody's really got a proper definition for it because nothing really is affordable. It's madness.
The other thing that's having an effect actually that we've noticed is also the affordability criteria for people to get mortgages. So after the financial crash in 2008, banks tightened their lending criteria, and they didn't just look at your deposit or your income, they looked at actually what you were spending. So that actually has an effect on people who have outgoings. So if you are caring for maybe your parents, or you're caring for children, or you have a health issue that means your outgoings are higher than the average, and that can impact, even though you may have the same income, it can impact on your affordability and your ability to get a mortgage and your time in the private rental sector and those kind of things.
How impossible is that target that the London plan has set? I know it's a draft London plan, but I mean, how enforceable?
It isn't really enforceable. It's worth, for another reason, I was looking around at other neighbouring boroughs, and most of them have failed their existing target in the last year.
Right.
So
Kingston and
the others are still existing. It does have an impact. It has an impact mostly on the work that you will be doing, planning applications committee and planning appeals, because if there is a balanced judgment with the inspector, if we've refused a scheme on design grounds and they say, well, you really need the homes and this isn't too bad, then we might end up with very average developments. But we've made our representations to the mayor, so fingers crossed that something will be
So we've got evidence now.
And we've got evidence, and we will take a different, we'll be trying to take a decent approach in our own plan.
Good question.
Yes, two quick questions. On the affordable housing, one thing I've noticed at the planning committee is this good thing is that the developers are asked to do a viability assessment. Bad thing I've noticed is that when they do the viability statement, at the end, their conclusion is, oh, we can't afford to do any affordable housing, so we can only afford to pay £5,000 or £10,000. How do we get around that? Because they provide black and white figures, and one of the reasons why they can prove that they're not making money is because they're purchasing the site at such a high price. It all goes back to what Linda was saying, that it then circulates back to that the property when it's finished is not affordable. So that was one question. The next question is, you mentioned develop, build to rent market. Now, one thing that I've noticed is that if you're going to get a buy to let mortgage, they have a very strict criteria that your rental income should be 3.5 times what your monthly payment is to the bank. So if your bank is saying, okay, your monthly mortgage is going to be £1,000, therefore your rent should be at least 3,500, and that's never the case because your rent is always going to be about 2,000 something. So a lot of people can't enter the buy-to-let market because they don't achieve the criteria of 3.5 times the rent. The 3.5 times the monthly payment. So those are my two sort of concerns as to how do we get around that.
Chair.
That's a very good point. I noticed in the actual report itself, and it's linked back onto Lynn's point about affordability. There's a recommendation about trying to establish a register of those wanting affordable housing as some sort of a lead generation to do that. I think, in the top of my head, that is, if that was established and we had numbers in there, if you are a developer or a small developer who fits the criteria you've outlined, knowing that you're entering a market with people who would instantly take up the property would no doubt aid a business case, I would say. Tara, do you have a...
If I could just, thank you, Chair, if I could comment on the first question about viability. The way all councils operate now, and lots of them are transparent like us, is that developers publish their viability assessment and we have it independently assessed. And there are industry benchmarks for what, for example, fees should be applied, what the cost of bricks should be in proportion to what's being built, and on those sorts of costs. So yes, sometimes in the early assessments we do get very inflated and more extraordinary costs, and you think, is it being built in gold or something? So what the independent assessor does is that they look at them and go, yes, this cost seems reasonable given the location and what's being built and the size of the property, etc. But this doesn't seem reasonable. So what you see when you get to planning committee, and what you should see at the end of any decision, is that if it says that they can only contribute 5,000, then that's based on an independent assessment that says actually in this particular case, for whatever reason, maybe there's extra costs to do with contamination or something, but yes, they can only contribute 5,000. So we aren't able to get around this such that that has been fully independently assessed. On the point about land values, though, there is a very kind of famous case that was running for years up at Islington involving a big site. I used to know the address, but I can't recall it off the top of my head now. And the developer had bought it at a really high land value, and to come in with a viability assessment saying, I paid this for it, so therefore I can't afford affordable housing. And it went to successful appeals and up through the courts even, and the conclusion overall was, that's not the planning system's problem that you overpaid for the site, so that's your problem, and you must still provide affordable housing. The average price that you should have paid for that land at the time that you bought it per acre was this, and you paid too much. So we are going to use the viability and take it as what you should have paid. So if somebody tries to sell it to their friend, for example, to inflate the price, that's not possible. There's a very famous and well-established court case that
I
prevents
think my
that.
point is that with these violent statements, and they're correct,
Yeah.
they don't lie on with the cost of construction, the property values, the interest they pay to the bank. A lot of this affordable, it's just not, it's very, very difficult to achieve these targets. I think that's the point I'm trying to make.
Councillor, at the moment we're
And that's
absolutely right.
something that we need to figure out how we're going to get around that. Especially because Linda's saying it's gone, it's gone from 300,000 to 700,000 because it's just going up.
At the moment, Councillor, you're right.
Now again, with Brexit, that will cause more instability. Maybe property prices go down, and then that viability statement is even worse because then they say actually we're making a loss.
Yes, it's the consequence of rising construction costs and falling house prices of benefits to some in our community, but they make it much harder to prove that affordable housing can be delivered. Also on small sites where often the margins are smaller, it also makes it much more difficult. And as we know, Merton is a borough of small sites.
And the buy to let, the criteria that the mortgage companies have that if our monthly payment is £1,000, that your rent should be 3.5 times because we want to cover ourselves for any voids, etc. That again is a very, very strict criteria. There's very few properties that meet that criteria.
More food for thought? Any other questions?
No.
And then,
Sorry, you can ask. Well, mine was more of a comment. As someone who's worked over decades for not big developers but small developers, the cost of what, as Linda said, the cost of it and the value of it are so different that I've worked for one or two, that you can, how can I put this, manipulate what goes on so as you maximise your profit without anybody else being anywhere near aware of what you've done. What I mean is, say for instance, you talk about that land value. It doesn't matter what the land value is. If you're going to build X and your profit margins are small, you actually manipulate how you do it to actually maximise your profit. And the council's not got a clue what's going to happen. And how can we, in fact, because what would then happen, and I know this because I've seen it done, council, and we talked about storing the sites, well, they slow down development.
you mean land banking?
Well, land banking if you haven't started, but even if you have started, you pull half your team off somewhere else you slow down until things change. And it's a very difficult way, because it's very difficult for councils and others to actually prove that this is what they're doing. I mean, I've actually done it for them, so I know it happens. And this makes sure that the amount of affordable accommodation, the amount of any accommodation that we want per year, is being manipulated for a profit. And instead of getting, if you like, 800, you only get 600, because they've slowed down on that year's production. And it's because, basically, because the cost of housing, not the value, but the cost of housing has risen so much that it's out of reach of quite a lot of people. I know that. My daughter went through it 2 years ago. And it's a very difficult problem, because councils have no power to actually change that.
I think that's probably...
Does that make sense, what I'm saying?
I understand. I think that's probably more...
I'm seeing it from the other... I'm seeing it from the developer's side, and how they deal with...
No, absolutely. It's a useful insight for the practicalities on the ground.
The councils put pressure on them, say, for instance, to put in more two-bedroom. And they think, look at that. And you never manipulate what goes on. Yeah. Sorry, but that's the way it is.
No, that's the interesting perspective. Carl, you had a question too?
There's a couple of bits. The first one is, obviously there's a fairly substantial section towards the back around old people's housing, housing around people with disabilities. I suppose there's some sort of detailed questions that I might come back with afterwards on it, but the general question is, I'm quite a big advocate for sort of joining up health and housing where possible. Has the Health and Wellbeing Board had any kind of sight of this yet, and will they have it at some point to look at it from that perspective? Because we can obviously look at it from a kind of local plan perspective, and there's actually in the room, but actually it might be useful to have that additional kind of oversight as well. The second one is kind of a couple of questions really, but would you be able to talk around the tables on page 84 and page 88? Because it looks on the face of it, and I may have misread it, but the table 34, for example, it says linked to delivery of 823 dwellings per annum, and then it looks at the affordable housing need, which is more than that, which seems quite a stark, where effectively, even if every single home is, in that instance, is affordable and affordable in the right way, we're still missing it. Is that the right reading? That sort of continues obviously to the other target as well, and similarly on page 88 there's a sort of similar thing with affordable ownership. So it'd just be useful to kind of understand both of those tables a bit more, if possible.
Sure. Okay.
You want to cover the table? On the first question, Councillor, it's a really good point. This committee is the first privileged committee to see the SHMA. We expect that other committees and we know that other council officers, for example, and the council teams are very interested in it. It's a good point about offering it to the Health and Wellbeing Board, and we expect that possibly sustainable communities and their housing aspect may be interested in some aspects that are to do with policy on housing, not planning. So if that's all right, we can approach the...
Yeah, I was going to make a suggestion. I'm happy to write to the chair to draw their attention to the report.
Just briefly in relation to the tables that you mentioned, with regards to the methodology behind this study, there were two scenarios in terms of a strategic housing figure that were that underpin this.
Mm-hmm.
So one was using the Mayor's draft strategic housing target for the borough, the 1,328, as a benchmark, and the population projections that underpinned that, to then come up with a figure or figures. And the other was the 823 figure, which is based on a methodology taking into account, to a certain degree, historic provision of housing in the borough. So it's more sort of supply-led, historic supply-led provision, and the nature of sites, as Tara mentioned, that come forward, the fact that there are small sites that come forward. So that's why, for example, in terms of affordable housing and the recommendations that have been made about figures, there are two figures. So one relates to using the Mayor's methodology, the 1,328 figure, and the other relates to the 823. Historically, affordable housing provision has always outstripped the supply. And this is where we need to have regard to this, but set it within the context of things like, well, what can realistically be achieved? What can realistically be achieved within the context of viability, within the context of competing land uses, and as a borough, the fact that, you know, we have other strategic objectives that this housing need needs to sort of sit within.
For example, London's housing needs as a whole is currently calculated at over 60,000 homes a year. London builds between 27,000 and 32,000 last year. It has done for a couple of decades. We don't currently in London in the South East touch the sides of meeting housing needs for all types of homes. Partly because of all sorts of things, but land availability, and the fact that also it's set in the context of wanting to, most of our housing land is under existing homes, and there's other priorities that every area has, such as the people that live there right now, such as making sure design is good, such as transport, etc. So need is calculated on a sort of academic side, and we try and get as close to that as we can, but most councils in London and the South East don't manage to achieve meeting housing needs because of huge myriads of
Yeah,
Meeting 100% of the
Yeah,
housing
that's
needs.
useful. That's helped me understand the kind of the table and that. Yeah, that's useful. Thank you.
Could I just pick up on something that Carl was talking about, well, it comes down to the kind of homes for life standard of homes, isn't it? Because I know that in the regeneration of Eastfield particularly, and possibly the other two estates, that Clarion are prioritising these homes for life to make sure that people don't have to keep moving on when something else happens to them. So they will be getting now, whatever their age is, they'll be getting the kind of home that can be adapted for their needs in the future. So that's sort of, I don't know which department that would be after regeneration, really. So it is going on, people preparing for, the standard of homes that people will need in the future.
I mean, you do raise a good point about the adaptability of homes. There's a few case study examples of other councils who, going back to Carl's point, teamed up with the NHS and used combined funding to adapt houses, so people coming back from, say, a major life-changing operation needing adaptable housing, and it was a change for them, so they were discharged quicker, things like that. So we have joined up thinking in the health and care system, and people, A, don't stay in hospital longer than need to, but B, at the same time have their housing need and lives are adapted, so they can continue the best way they can do.
But can I say that if by some miracle all of a sudden London produced at 60,000 a year, would we be able to keep up with all the other needs we'd have, like healthcare, transport, buses, roads? Would all of that be able to keep pace with that?
Well, last time London built that many homes was when the suburbs out here were built in the 1920s and 1930s. That was the last time London built 60-something thousand homes per year. And in the interwar periods, we've never done it since. and there was an awful lot of land available, obviously. I mean, one only has to go to the top of this building and look south, and you can imagine that just being fields. And so that's the kind of quantity of land you need to achieve 60,000 homes year on year. So, but it is a good point you raised, Councillor, whether or not one of the restrictions on not doing this now, on land availability and finance, is simply that infrastructure may not be able to keep pace with that.
I mean, my house is built on an orchard, I know that.
Councillor Clare, just make a point on lifetime homes.
Sure.
Previously, that fell into the planning system, and we had a standard called lifetime homes. Every council has a slightly different standard, which is a bit tricky sometimes for developers. So what government did is they pulled it into building regulations. Now there are 3 main standards in building regulations. 1 is basic. 2 is adaptable, so you might not have provision for chairlift or anything, but your home can be adapted to fit one, so you have larger doorways and higher doorways. And the other main standards then are actually kitted out. In London, we all have 100% of homes should be adaptable, so we don't use the basic standard at all. And there is a percentage, and I forget whether it's 10 or 20% now, that need to be fully
Wheelchair.
wheelchair
Yeah,
compliant.
10%.
Yeah. So that's the situation in London. So all homes, if you like a lifetime home, so should be. But as Councillor Sanford said, you can do more with design of some homes about making sure that they can be fully kitted out for.
Can I blow the trumpet for Hague Housing, because they've done that? Out of the 67, they've got 7 flats that are completely wheelchair access, plus they've got movable worktop heights, they've got everything there that you could possibly need for any sort of disability. And it's all social housing because it's for everybody, but the amount of adaptations they've put in for the whole site is quite remarkable. Now, if we had loads of developers like them, we'd be able to fulfil this, but they're a rarity, very much so. Because I've had 2 or 3 trips going round, and they got extra wide doorways. You know, everything is done to make life easier, no matter what your disability is. It's absolutely incredible, but they're very rare.
Yeah.
They're the only ones that will come into.
It's funded by the Ministry of Defence
Yeah,
for the
well,
ex-soldiers, so it's a wonderful scheme that's come.
Are there any further questions, comments, points of clarification?
Can I ask a last quick one? And again, it may be just me not quite at a different table, but you talked about there is a need for 3-bed homes, which I completely recognise. How does that tally up with the need? How does people's need tally up with their ability to afford a 3-bedroom home in Merton? Because my sort of anecdotal experience, I don't know how much the stats back this up, but a lot of families tend to live in small homes just because it's expensive to live here. There's a lot of families in 2-bed flats and 2-bed homes. And is that where the need is, and those families may not be able to afford those 3-bed homes, or is there a kind of clear demographic?
I mean, I think this is why overall the study recommends that the emphasis in terms of affordable housing should be, the greatest proportion should be on low cost rented housing. And there is something in here that says insofar as affordable home ownership is concerned, that the value of that should be pitched at something equivalent to private rented, affordable private rented. So I don't know the methodology in detail, but there is.
It was market. I think I may be wrong. It was market minus.
Yes, it says.
Minus 20%. Is that the?
They used the benchmark across the market rate across each of
Yes,
sub
yes.
areas.
Can we go back to on that, Councillor?
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
it's,
I think
No, that's fine. Yeah,
such a
It was-
massive tone, but really detailed questions are.
Can I add on that as well? I think the reality is we're looking at several housing markets across the borough, really, because anecdotal example
I mean, the
ourselves.
villages. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, for me and my family, we managed to buy a 3-bed house several years ago because we couldn't afford to live in Tooting, because we were renting in Tooting. Like many families, you move down as you go. And in the east of the borough, Pollard Hill, there are 3-bed houses. You could get relatively, much cheaper than the average in the borough. And the report shows that in the east of the borough, you can still get that. So I think it's, it is that mismatch of some markets are quite overpriced and over, as you say, people buy, they buy lower, but in terms of capacity because they can't afford to buy a 3-bed.
Yeah.
Whereas in some parts of the borough, that spending power, that probably could buy them a 3 or 4-bed. It depends on other issues, which is infrastructure and desirability where people want to live as well. It's a challenge there.
Yeah, of course. I was just wondering if that was obvious, but that's
Just picking up on a point. So what the study says is it says in setting housing costs in the affordable home ownership sector, the study recommends that the council considers setting prices at levels which in income terms are equivalent to the level needed to access private rented housing. And it's saying in terms of the overall proportion of affordable housing, we should be doing no more than 10% in terms of affordable home ownership. And that affordable home ownership should be no more than equivalent terms of private rented housing, should be no more.
okay. I'm slightly confused about this one.
Yeah, it's yes.
I think it's definitely worth an email.
Yeah.
Afterwards, and I'll write that as well. Any additional questions before we move the recommendation? So, recommendation is to, as we've noted, the key findings of the study, and that it forms part of the evidence to inform and support preparations for the new borough plan. Does everyone agree? Yes. Excellent. Thank you very much. And I think it's worth, after this, I'll do a roundup, but it's worth putting together further questions, points of clarity. I think everyone's got additional points, and I think it'd be worth everyone being looped into those answers as well, for just for background. And as Tara and Val said, this document is clearly a lot of thought has gone into it. And once other colleagues, including those from other committees, review it, there may be additional points that be worth us knowing about or reflecting on. So the next item of work of business is the South West London Waste Consultation report. So for this, we are recommending a consultation, and if I just quickly summarise for Tara, if you wouldn't mind talking a bit further on it. So effectively, the main change in this from the current plan is a tightening of the designations of the areas. So before, wider areas were designated as waste sites, but now there's more pinpoint accuracy about where these sites should be, which is obviously good. And for us in the borough, a really potential opportunity is the retiring of Benedict Wharf site, which is the capacity that can be absorbed by a new site in Sutton. And there are, of course, as we know, probably colleagues around the table are aware, discussions going on with GLA about this now, but that's a really interesting opportunity how we use proper sort of zoning and land management to free up a bit of land in a crucial part of the borough where you can build potential 600 units, if not a bit more. And
Excuse me, before you go on, isn't there pollution on that side? Or is that?
There is, but no, that's something that can be addressed through the planning process. The site's been used for all sorts of things down through the years, and the pollution isn't as bad as initially thought. But yes, it was addressed.
I think all sites hopefully get decontaminated as they are built on. But yes, and again, just for clarity, this isn't just us who be consulting on this document, it'll be Kingston, Sutton and Croydon as well. So Tara,
Thank you, Chair. Just to clarify that this is planning document, part of the local plan. It has nothing to do with bin collection or the earlier contract or anything like that. So each council has to have a plan to deal with waste facilities, so that when anyone submits an application for something that includes a waste facility, the council's planning application committee or delegated officers have a book of policies in order to make that decision. And about 10 years ago, the four authorities, us and Kingston, Croydon and Sutton, did that very plan. And now we need to revise it because it's just coming up to retirement in a couple of years. I'm going to point out the key difference. You probably won't have used the existing plan very much because there aren't actually that many waste facilities that come forward. It's not like housing applications that the planning application committee sees a lot. But waste facilities, by their nature, are often quite controversial. So we hear a lot about them when they do come through. In London, because not all London boroughs can deal with their waste within their boundaries, so someone like the City of London would really struggle to try and process waste within the City of London. So in London, what we do is that the mayor adds up all the waste that all the boroughs produce, and it apportions out a certain amount for each of the boroughs to deal with. So most of the boroughs, apart from the very central ones, deal with a slightly higher amount of waste because because we're dealing with waste from the City of London. And that's not too unusual because many people, live in one borough and work in another. The good news is that the plan is based on evidence, and the evidence proves that we can deal with our London plan apportionment within the four boroughs, and it proves that we don't need as much land to do so. Our waste facilities right across the board, whoever they're run by, are pretty efficient. And so we are proposing that this plan, instead of marking out whole industrial estates where you can have waste facilities anywhere within them, it says actually only existing sites could be intensified. And that's the main difference really. The next steps for this are to head to Merton's cabinet, but also to the executive committees at Croydon, Kingston and Sutton. And should this be approved by your equivalents there and the executive committees, then this will go for 6-week consultation between about the 30th of October to mid-December, I think, across all four boroughs. And we'll be contacting people in the usual way about this consultation. It is worth saying, as the chair mentioned, that some positive news as well for the Merton area is that the evidence supports that the South London waste plan boroughs can deal with more waste if the Suez site moves from Mitcham to Sutton, and Sutton Council approved a planning application last week to allow that to happen. The Mayor of London doesn't quite agree with that at this stage, so we need to make sure we provide it. There's very strong protection for industrial uses, so there is a view that there is a strategic policy that says that even if you don't need it for that particular use, such as waste, Suez, you might put other industrial uses on that Benedict Wharf site. Our contention is obviously that the site is not suitable for logistics or HGVs or industrial or anything like that. And I believe that we're fully evidenced by Suez, who've owned that site for 20 years, and they have a planning permission that they can't implement because it's next to a school, so we haven't allowed them operate during school hours, and they can't do a right turn because the road, Church Road towards Cricket Green is really narrow. And all sorts of other characteristics that we can talk through. So it is positive in terms of Benedict Wharf in that it does demonstrate that the waste will be much more efficiently managed and we'll be able to manage more of it if it were to move. So in a way it supports that approach as well. I'd be happy to take any questions, Chair.
Brilliant, thank you, Tara. So I've got a few potential questions for colleagues who have anything particular raised. Carl.
Sorry, it's always me, isn't it?
That's all right.
It's just a quick one about the consultation itself. It talked about who you're going to talk to. There isn't anything about the people that live sort of directly around these sites. Is there going to be sort of special efforts made to reach those people, or will they just be sort of lumped in with the sort of people going to age groups, all of that kind of stuff.
We'll be delighted.
Well, that's it.
Well, you know, but it's just sort of, they may want to know about it.
I think, Councillor, if we were proposing new sites, we would definitely do that. But
Okay.
these sites are today operating in waste uses. So we are simply telling them that that site is, as with the current planning system, as with the current owners, is probably going to continue to operate in waste use. So while we will alert everybody using the normal channels, we weren't going to do dedicated letter drops around the site to say, actually, as with the current thing that's there today, it's probably going to stay there in plain terms unless the owner decides to do something different with it. So that's, I wouldn't suggest that we do that for this particular consultation.
Okay.
Any further questions? I've got another question in a second, but building off Carl's point, is there any additional evidence that we've had previously from, as Linda remarked, from local residents? I know that there's always been concerns about the level of traffic and the noise, etc. of the area. In the smell, that can be fed back as part of the through the process at all, to support the suggestion that the site can be retired.
Yes, we have provided all that evidence to the mayor's officers, and we're still hopeful of persuading them that this site is not suitable for continued industrial use or continued waste use. I think the next step may be even a site visit. We're in the slightly unusual position in that local residents, local community groups, the landowner, the council, the nearby schools, and everybody else involved all support the principle of that site not being in the use it currently is. And the owner has actually invested millions in buying another site and getting permission to move. And yet we may be stuck with a site that's earmarked for heavy industry, which is, you would never do that in a modern planning system. So we're really quite sure that we have a wealth of evidence. And indeed, the mayor has said that through the local plan process, he can look at the de-designation of the site, which we will continue to pursue. However, that means that it's another 2 and a bit years before Suez might retire it, and that is that necessary, really?
You can understand in a way why. I mean, there was always big resistance against changing those sites because it's so easy, isn't it, to say the land value will shoot up if you put residential on there. But when you look at some of the things that have happened, where you've got, blocks, commercial blocks, when we've now got people living in on industrial estates, I mean, that is appalling. And so, it's not surprising there would be a question mark over it. But I think, a visit. They need to go down and look at it, don't they? Yeah, it's particularly in the summer. I mean, heavy vehicles and the smell is really not good at all. So close to a school.
Yeah,
It's not
three
nice,
schools.
is
Yeah, fingers crossed.
Any additional questions, please? Anyone want to join the site visit? Okay, so if I turn to the recommendations, so again, recap, we are recommending, we are advising that the proposed sites to Cabinet for a 6-week consultation on the draft plan between October and December. And again, we are delegating the final details to the Director of Environment and Regeneration and Cabinet member as well. Is everyone agree? Thank you. And so to the final bit of business tonight, the play and pitch strategy. So again, I'll just introduce, and Tara will include additional details and points of clarification. So for me, this was a really interesting read about the stock capacity of our sports facilities and pitches, and thinking ahead to my boy in a few years' time, how will he go on play football or rugby? Of course, there's facilities there, but as we know, because of our previous bit of business, population is going to be increasing and there's more demand. So the top line here is additional facilities, sport, especially as we know many of us here are councillors in the east of the borough, in that area, and the main recommendation is to continue the work of the implementation group. So this group, Tara may want to go into further details on this, but the group actually co-authored the reports with council and experts from the sports bodies, and it's recommended as part of this report that that work continues as part of that group to work out finer details as well. And in terms of just a summary of the current stock, so very quick roundup. So football, we need more pitches. Cricket, again, rugby, not enough capacity at Range Park. Hockey, again, no sites. AstroTurf pitches, 5. Tennis, again. Surprisingly, the bowls green, we do have another site of. Athletics as well, no need for additional tracks. And water sports as well, we're at capacity that we are at. And again, if you want to talk site specific, one of the interesting ones I thought was the United Westminster School sports ground, which is in Eastfields, and recommendation to build obviously properties on it, but at the same time have sports facilities, exactly. So that's an interesting proposal there as well. So,
I'm not sure if that's fallen through, hasn't it? Last time we advised about it, because we were looking to use part of that site for resources, regeneration of resources. I don't know.
Yes, there's still open space in sports facilities that they're still pursuing residential as a mixed use, but I can update you.
Yeah. So that's the last I heard from Carol anyway, that it's feasible or something.
But in the attempt to do that, they're going to be wanting to build on metropolitan land.
I don't think that one's metropolitan.
No, that's not.
Well, but some of it will be. I mean, say that you want to enhance sport in the borough, it's fine, but if it's going to be at the cost of losing land, it's going to be tricky, isn't it? It'll be very controversial.
But all of this can be very frustrating, because I've been a member of the Lawn Park Planners Trust for years, and we've spent between 40 and 50,000 on surveys, reports and so on, and we would get to put all football pitches, rugby pitches, cricket pitches, and then eventually redo the tennis and one or two other things. And when we were beginning to get somewhere, the bloody council came along and stuck a brand new leisure centre right where we were going to put our changing rooms. And now we've had to completely rethink, because we've now, our money is dried up. As I say, we spent 40 or 50,000 on surveys and God knows what else. And we've gone back,
Back to the drawing board.
well, we started at A, we got to about halfway through the alphabet, and now we're back at AB again. And we've been stuck there ever since, because we couldn't do anything while the pavilion, the new leisure centre was being built. And now we're just stuck there. And those playing fields are still, after what? When did Goodison Wicks give us back the leasehold? That was what? About 15 years ago, wasn't it? And they've been, all those sports pitches which were given to us by the Greater London Council before they were abolished for sports pitches, it's just grassland. And it's so frustrating.
It's much needed capacity then. Probably.
Yeah, it is. Then there's 40,000 quid less.
Maybe this will help, Councillor. Councillors, also to say that this is quite a thick tome, and it will be going to Cabinet in October or November. So please take it away and digest it. As even for the October Cabinet, there's at least a couple of weeks if you want to take the time and not any particular questions afterwards. I really love this piece of research, because it takes ages to do. Because what happens is that the steering groups get together, and it's made up of the governing bodies for sport, so the governing body for football and for hockey and for tennis and for rugby, and then minority sports don't seem to have governing bodies, probably because they can't afford them, but they have representatives who often voluntarily campaign on their behalf. And they pitch in as well, no pun intended. And Sport England and the council. And the consultants we used have to interview all the winter sports, and they have to go to every single winter club in this borough and go out and chat to them, whether it's in Rains Sports Club in Rains Park or whether it's someone who operates on a school playground on a Saturday. And they go and talk to them and contact them and find out who plays there and what they pay for their pitches and what the demand is and whether they're losing members or gaining members. And they have to do this for all the sports. And then they have to come out in the summer and contact all the cricket clubs and rugby, tennis clubs and all the other summer sports and do the same again. And they have to contact clubs that rent pitches in this borough and clubs that are in this borough that can't rent pitches so go elsewhere. And all that wealth of information is in about an inch thick appendices at the back. And what it comes out with is, as the chair eloquently summarised, the supply and demand for pitches in the borough. And it goes into specific sites, so if you have sites in your ward, or if you have sites that you know and care about, there will be information about what people think about the quality of that site and what the demand is for the particular playing on that site by a range of sports. The chair summarised the main sports and the supply and demand issues with them. Football, as with our previous study a number of years ago, we need more supply for young people, for children, and for the 11 plus as well, more mini pitches. And we need a bit more of adult pitches as well, but the main driver is the youth football. There's also a high demand for cricket, and the national governing body for cricket are very keen on trying to source funding for South London, including Merton, actually improve cricket facilities. You may have seen in some parks, for example in Tooting Common, they have installed an artificial grass wicket, and they've done the same in Streatham Common, and they're looking for more funding to do that across London. They can't do that until we've adopted this. One of the requirements for Sport England is that any borough who they want to draw government funding from the Department of, I think it's Media, Culture and Sports. Yeah, they have to have an adopted playing pitch strategy. And so they're really keen for us to take this forward and adopt it. The reason that all the actions, so if you've stuck the time, do read the recommendations, and they're all recommended by the steering group, because it won't be the council that comes along and supplies all these new sports facilities. A lot of the time, the governing bodies, especially for the bigger sports, have access to far more funding than we could ever have, and they are the experts in their field. So they are able to go to government and to the lottery fund and to Sport England and draw down funding once we adopt this. And that's the approach we'll be taking over the next number of years. I would also say that in some cases that there will be proposals to investigate certain sites. So it might say investigate a certain site for a rugby pitch or a football pitch. And maybe that site is already used, or maybe that site is right next to a nature reserve, or there might be other issues that mean that it's going to be difficult to realise. But that's why it talks about investigating these sites in your wards to see if these sports facilities can be taken forward. So this will form a key piece of evidence for the local plan, especially relating to a few of the sites in Young Westminster Sport Ground, the old site known as Lessa in Rains Park, and also Chidley Mitcham Hub, for example, are very keen to get this through because they have applications in for their particular site that this will be able to make a difference to. So we're proposing to take it to Cabinet in the next, either October or November, and we'll be very keen for any feedback you have.
Can I just add to that? I mean, I'm being very parochial. This is the same site, but the main problem is because of the lack of funding from council, because they step aside, obviously, because they've got the money. What we found when we were doing our surveys and all of this is most people around wanted to know when we were going to putting back tennis, because there are a couple of sites there where they had tennis. I mean, my daughter, she did tennis training years ago on there, But the problem is, what you have to do, you've got to make this viable so you can pay for maintenance. What we found was the only way you could do it and make it viable was to supply the big sports first, i.e. football, rugby and possibly cricket. And things like the tennis had to wait because individually, apart from Wimbledon, supply of tennis is not financially viable. You know, people might come and say, oh, I want to play every week. But when you add up the amount of finance that will be coming in, it's nowhere near enough to maintain it. So you have to do the big things first and then add to it maybe 3 or 4 years later, maybe longer. That's what we found anyway.
And I mean, if you also look at the distribution of the sports across the borough, there's a sort of little bit of a divide between sort of football more in the east and sort of tennis and dog-to-door sports in the west of the borough. So take a round of questions if there is any. So Dennis, is there any product you've got? Do you want to question shortly?
Well, no, I was just, what are the, do we know what are it is proposed for the old swimming pool site? But as far as I'm aware, it's just going to be put back to
What do you
field.
mean on Walton Hall?
Yeah,
Well, the old leisure centre's gone, it's been flattened,
yeah.
and it's going back to Parkland. And
Well,
that's
what I
the
mean,
deal,
yeah, so
because
right.
it is metropolitan open land after all. And it's,
Oh,
also,
yeah.
it's also a conservation area,
Yeah.
so the deal was that area will be put back,
Right.
replacing the area that's
They've
already been
to the-
taken.
the new
Yeah.
one. Yeah, no, that's okay, no, I was just checking.
Good point. Any further questions? Points of clarification? So again, because this is particularly meaty, maybe worth running an email thread so that everyone contributes. And then if we've got, when we get the answer to the questions, then at least everyone knows what they are, because sometimes you may think of there may be a question, you may not know the question, but someone else has thought of it, or maybe manage to connect the dots from their own experience. Obviously, Dennis has clearly shown us now with the background that what you've worked. Carl, do you have a
It was just to say that, yeah, thank you for offering the additional time to follow up with email, because it's quite meaty, and obviously there's some quite specific bits in it that would be useful to be able to sort of spend a bit more time with. So I think, you know, I certainly will do that. And obviously, as well, it says that this is reviewed every year anyway, so it will come back sort of next year.
Yeah.
What just out of interest, what format does it come back in? Because they said it's not this sort of level of detail. What would we likely get next year?
We look at the action points really. So there's a recommendation section with quite a few recommendations. We'll be reviewing those. And the other thing we'd probably update you on is if there have been any significant developments. So, for example, if the National Governing Body for Cricket had managed to secure funding to install artificial wickets again in particular sites in the borough, we'd be able to come back and say this has happened since. Or any of the steering group have managed to secure funding for this part of London. We'd let you know.
Okay, great. There's another question that you might not be able to answer, because it's about the sort of decision making. But in terms of, we talk about SIL in here, and it being sort of one of the things earmarked for SIL. There's a few unsecured sites, which are school sites, which in some point in the future may want to expand the sort of physical building. What weight, generally speaking, in both in planning terms and in terms of the sort of the pull on SIL is this likely to have compared to other needs, or is that just about a sort of a planning judgment, I suppose? Or
It's a very big question, Councillor. I think obviously with something like this, that ones that actually can really access finance are the national governing bodies for the various domain sports. So certainly if there was funding available from elsewhere, we wouldn't be recommending to councillors that they consider a community infrastructure levy instead of funding that's available elsewhere. I would say that that's as much as I can really say on that particular point.
That's fine. I thought that might be the case, but I thought
Any further points? Okay. Again, after the meeting, we'll start an email thread and we'll have additional questions and answers. I think the recommendation then is that we recommend to Cabinet to adopt this play and pitch strategy, which will now form the evidence base as part of the borough plan. Does everyone agree?
Thanks.
Super. Thank you again. So, quick round of any other business. Any questions, additional issues people want to raise? I know.
Me again, I'm dragging the meeting on. I'm sorry, guys. In relation, we had a pre-conversation earlier today just about the kind of the weight of documents that come to the meeting, which is, it's great to have all this in front of us and be able to scrutinise it, but it'd be useful for future meetings to at least, if we can't get the documents themselves further in advance, to at least know we're going to have some big documents coming on a particular day, so we can sort of plan around it. I wasn't able to access these until yesterday, just because that was when I could come into the office and get them. So it'd be useful to have a bit more notice to say next meeting there's going to be however many 100 pages, and to block out a bit of time to be able to either pick them up or read them.
That's a very good point, Councillor, and apologies that we didn't recognise this before. Also, I think what we can do is let you know whether something is something that you can take your time to look at, and we'll discuss at the meeting, but you can ask questions after, or something that's on a track for approval, and therefore we really must be making comments by a certain date because it's going to the next step, and divide things into those things. I'm also aware that some people prefer electronic and tend to use electronic, and many people prefer paper, so if there's any particular preference, I'm really happy to.
Maybe we can capture that as well, and so we've got that on record.
That would be useful.
I mean that's a fair point. I mean, some of these documents were literally finalised at the last minute. I mean, like the plain pitch strategy. So it's almost like they're writing a report and in advance almost of the finalised actual document that we're writing on, if that makes any sense. So,
I completely appreciate the pressure on you as well, but it's just
I think there's definitely an action for myself as well, working with Tara, is how do we have a more forward grid? So, like you say, at least there's an earmark to saying this month there's going to be maybe a heavier demand on your eyesight, going through them. But I think hopefully you'll agree that while they were very lengthy and numerous in terms of the information, they're very valuable and very weighty. I particularly, from a local war perspective, I learned a lot more about from the statistical side and then the future growth and potential that's happening in my part of Merton. Okay, so unless there's anything else, I'll call this meeting adjourned. Date next meeting is the 28th of November. November.
All right. Is that right? Is the design issue about that?
Isn't it 28th? I haven't got my...
Well, we'll sort that out. We've got cards, so we can do it.
Yeah, it's just every day.
Is it?
Thank you very much.